First of all, good evening to the Indian audience for joining in so late at night, especially after work hours. I'm sure many of you would be in your homes right now, and I am really grateful that so many of you have turned up today. Now, for those of you who are new to CCS, and I see quite a few new faces here, this is not the first time that we're hosting John. We had that pleasure way back in 2014 when we hosted him for the Asia Liberty Forum. I was, of course, nowhere in the scenario. I was probably around 10 years of age back then, and obviously I didn't know about CCS. Regardless, it is very meaningful to have him back here with us again after 12 years. And in some sense, symbolic as well, because today's January, and when we last hosted him, it was January as well, January 2014. So today's eBaithak is a very special topic, that of why open societies need open inquiry. Now, the question of academic freedom, I think, is extremely poignant. It is very pressing, it's very urgent, and I think we need to have more conversations around it because I believe academic freedom, in some sense, is retreating around the world. And I don't think we could have gotten someone better to speak about it than Dr. Tomasi, who is the inaugural president of the Heterodox Academy and was previously professor of political science at Brown University. He is the author of Liberalism Beyond Justice, Free Market Fairness, and numerous influential articles in political philosophy. Now, a brief housekeeping rule before we begin, which is all of you will be allowed to ask questions to John after an hour of moderated discussion. So please keep your questions ready because we will have a live Q&A at the very end. So to begin, John, tell us a bit about your intellectual beginnings. What drove you to the study of political philosophy, and especially the kind of questions which you have tackled in your scholarly endeavors?
Well, thank you, Anshu. First, let me just say that I'm really, really honored to be speaking with you again. Um, I, I'm a huge fan of the Center for Civil Society, and I think this is my first time speaking at Hindu College, but I've heard of Hindu College, so it's really a pleasure for me to be here with you and your audience. Intellectual beginnings, is that what you asked about? So my intellectual beginnings were somewhat strange. I followed an unusual path. I was a terrible student in high school. I grew up in a very small town on the Canadian border. My father died when I was young, and my mother raised me and my three sisters with a real love for learning, but without much money, let's say. And I was just a terrible student. In high school, I loved sport. I played soccer avidly in the fall. I played ice hockey, which is a huge sport where I lived in the winter. I played tennis in the spring, and I failed my classes all throughout all those years. And I would routinely have meetings with my coaches, with the school principal, trying to find some way to have my miserable grade point average be judged just barely high enough that I'd be eligible to be allowed to continue playing sport. That's all I cared about. And in college too, and I went to college, I applied to a lot of places and got rejected a lot of places. I finally was accepted at a small liberal arts school. And when I was there, I took a class on philosophy, Introduction to Philosophy. And the first paper assignment was we read a reading from Descartes about Descartes' famous section where he talks about, imagine when you fall asleep and you have a dream, and your dream is very vivid. So you think you're actually in the dream, as many of us do when we fall asleep. And Descartes says, well, once you've fallen asleep once and you've had a very vivid dream like that, how do you know that you're not dreaming right now? How do you know that this world you're living in, you think you're living in the life that you're leading, is not all just a dream and you're about to wake up and it's all false? That's a way to formulate a classic philosophical question. How do we know that there's a material world out there beyond us? And we all know there's a material world out there beyond us, right? But I remember still vividly when I was 19, sitting down to write my first philosophy paper. And I thought, oh, this will be easy. It's obvious that there's a material world. I'll just write a paper about why we know it's there. But I found that I couldn't do it. And I realized then that many philosophers have struggled with that question. How do you prove philosophically that there's a material world outside of ourselves? And I just could not believe that there was a discipline in an area of questions that were insoluble, but fascinating, and fascinating in part because they were so insoluble. So that got me hooked in philosophy when I was about 19 years old. Up till then, I was reading a lot of literature. I thought literature was the path to wisdom. But then I thought, well, there's this new thing I hadn't heard about, philosophy. Maybe there's wisdom in philosophy. So I studied philosophy, and I again continued my path of being a very I guess, independent-minded student, I suppose. And I was in and out of 5 different colleges, again, playing sports, but now thinking more about ideas. And I finally applied to grad school, got in nowhere. Finally got accepted at the University of Arizona. And I went there, then everything changed and I started grad school. And in grad school, because in grad school they encourage you to do exactly what I'd always done myself, which is just think about the problems that interest me and don't think about the problems and assignments that don't interest me. So in graduate school, what they care about is, are you writing fresh papers with fresh ideas? And for the first time in my life, I found that my wayward ways were being rewarded. And my career changed dramatically then. I got a scholarship to go to Oxford, and then I got recruited to Princeton, and then to Stanford, and eventually had a long career at Brown. So anyway, that's kind of a long answer to your question, but I was an extremely wayward student, kind of a lost academic, but I always loved the ideas. And it was really the ideas of philosophy that captured my imagination, and they hold me. Philosophy owns me still. I still worry about when I go to bed at night. I still think about Descartes, and I wonder when I go to sleep and I dream, am I really here? Is it really me? Is this my life, or is this someone else's life? Those questions, those strange philosophical questions, still really animate me. I moved to political philosophy too, and I can tell you about that if you want to hear that. But that's kind of my that's my origin story in a nutshell.
Uh, Thank you for that. I remember Descartes vividly haunting me when I was studying and trying to at least understand foundationalism. That said, you talked about your tenure at Brown slightly. I mean, you just dropped it there, and I believe you were there for at least nearly 3 decades, about 27 years.
Yeah,
Right. So why
27
did
years.
you? That's a long time. So why did you leave Brown University to take up your current inaugural position at Heterodox Academy?
Well, part of the reason was I never wanted to be an academic. I always loved philosophy. And I realized at some point when I was, I think, 23 or 24, that by becoming a professor, I would have time to do philosophy. And that was, to me, a great gift to have the possibility of a career where I could have time to actually work on these problems. And I was just thinking, I was just so aware of how lucky I was to live in a society that could afford to have positions where some people could make a living thinking of these philosophical thoughts. It's not the case that every society and every epoch of human history has had the kind of commitment to have universities where people could think freely. So that's how I was thinking about philosophy then. At Brown, I really started to think about political philosophy, and I started applying some of the tools that I'd learned doing some of the harder problems in philosophy to political philosophy. And I guess I just increasingly became aware of the importance of freedom and the importance of a free society. And I became convinced that a free society ultimately resides in the minds of the people who are in that society. Of course, we have to have free institutions if we're going to have freedoms that are protected. But deeper than that, more basic than that, a free society relies upon free thinking, free individuals, people with minds of their own, thinking of their thoughts in their own ways. And I realized that there's a connection between the free society, which I'm deeply committed to and passionate about, and something like the idea of a free university, a university that would provide students with opportunities to think for themselves, that would respect the next generation of people, the next generation of citizens, to think about their own ideas in their own ways. And I became increasingly worried that our universities had become homogeneous, that our universities were, especially in the US, but not only the US, it's happened around the world, that our universities have become monolithic. The viewpoint diversity has shrunk in ways that really undercut the possibilities of free thinking. And Heterodox Academy, should I say a bit about what Heterodox Academy is for the audience? I don't know if they know, or should I say, Anshu, guide me? What would you like?
Sure. Please do tell us a bit about the Heterodox Academy. I don't think they would be aware.
Yeah, so I left my comfortable, hard-earned, endowed chair at Brown, where I had a job for life, and I got up from my chair and I walked away to run a nonprofit called Heterodox Academy. It was founded 10 years ago by Jonathan Haidt, who's a dear and old friend of mine. And John Haidt started this organization. It's an international organization of professors who have different political views, different political ideologies, but we're all committed to the idea for various reasons that universities should be more free. And one thing we say, so we're professors all around the world. Um, there's about 8,000 of us now, and we're growing still. I think there are about 45 members in India, many of them many of them at the University of Delhi, as it turns out. And we're people who love our universities and we want to make them better. Or as I like to say, we love our universities enough that we're willing to work hard to make them better. And we love our universities the way Socrates loved Athens. And some of the audience probably knows that Socrates loved Athens not uncritically. He was highly critical of Athens, but he loved Athens enduringly, relentlessly, doggedly. And he famously would rarely left Athens. He would stay there to keep being the gadfly to them. Similarly, to some degree, the members of HXA, Heterodox Academy, we love our universities in those ways. We criticize them openly, but we're not people who are trying to tear our universities down. We're people who love them enough to want to make them better. So HXA does activity. We have a center in New York. So I took up the presidency of Heterodox Academy. They recruited me away from Brown 5 years ago now. And we built a research center in New York City in Times Square. It's called the Siegel Center for Academic Pluralism. We host visiting scholars from around the world who come and spend residency years with us, a year in residence with us or a semester. And we gather really intelligent people who share idea of the free society being connected to the free university. And we have conversations about the challenges to freedom in the university, the coming challenges that we see down the road. And we work out replies and answers and toolkits for university presidents to use to try to improve their universities. So it's been a big shift for me. I'm going from being an academic to being running a nonprofit is quite a change. I work many longer hours. I always work long hours thinking about philosophy, but now I do long hours in meetings and fundraising and building a team and all that kind of stuff. But it's been a great adventure, and I feel really fortunate to have this chance to try at this particular moment, especially to try to help reform our universities from the inside. And we'll talk later on in this conversation on Shiv about some of the attacks on universities that are happening from the outside, especially perhaps in the US, but not only here. But we work from the inside to try to make them better.
Right. By the way, I didn't know that Heterodox Academy had a presence here in India, and I was amused that you mentioned that. So that was very interesting for me, and I definitely want to know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
We have members everywhere. It's fascinating. We have members in Ethiopia, Sweden, Bangladesh, you name it. We have concentrations, and we have an active group in Southeast Asia that connects various individual members across various countries in that region, and they meet regularly online to have discussions about these issues. And we learn a lot from our fellow members in other countries because they face problems that are different than the ones we face in the U.S. So we learn from them. And I'll just say as a pitch that any of you who work at universities as a professor, as an administrator, as a graduate student, you can join Heterodox Academy. Go online, join us, build up the concentration. I'd love to see us build up the membership in India, and I do a lot to support those efforts.
I'm sure that would be very interesting. We might have some faculty members in this meeting as well who might be interested in that. Now that I think about the Indian university as well, I think a lack of viewpoint diversity really affects how we do social sciences here in this country. I think that would be the same almost everywhere in the world. And especially here in this country, there's been a terrible groupthink with, say, post colonial studies or cultural philosophy. I
Yes,
mean, you know about those areas. So I was
I do.
wondering if you could give an example, say, in political thought, of how the lack of viewpoint diversity has kind of limited our pursuit of knowledge at universities.
Sure. I'll say first that post-colonial studies, I think, is really important, and I think there are some really important insights within that approach to understanding our world. The problem that's happened in the U.S. and some other places too is that it's become so much of a dominant paradigm that people who work within that paradigm are not always as liberal as they might be about listening to criticisms of their views. So post-colonial studies has important insights that I think every student should study, should be aware of, should study, but they should do it for themselves with free minds. And that means giving students the chance to think about the criticisms of that way of thinking, the defenses of society as they exist and as they might be. But back to your question about an example, there's an example about groupthink that I'll share with you that it's pretty fundamental and it's kind of striking. So it's a bit historical. It'll be before you were born, I think. Yes, it'll be before you. But it's from early in my career. When I was in high school, I suppose, before I became interested in middle school. Actually, maybe I was in middle school when these books came out. But anyway, in 1902, there were two incredible books in philosophy, incredibly important books in political philosophy, published at about the same time, both out of Harvard. And one was John Rawls's A Theory of Justice, which was published in 1972, and then Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which was published in 1974. They were both masterworks. One's a defense of a big state, welfare state style liberalism and social justice. Nozick's, that was Rawls's book. Nozick's book was this equally brilliant defense of the free society in a very strict libertarian way. Individuals are all that matter. Anarchy is a real possibility, or the minimal state, as Nozick ended up defending. But what's interesting is that is the way those two books were received and the intellectual path that flowed from each of those books. So Rawls's book was he was writing a book that he wrote a book that had a lot of imperfections and needed a lot of work. It had some major problems in the justification and the foundations of the book. So much so that about 10 years later, Rawls rewrote the whole foundation and fixed it. But Rawls was writing a book, he wrote a book that appealed to the dominant intuitions of most academics, especially at Harvard and around Cambridge, which were very left of center, very big state, optimistic about the big state, somewhat authoritarian in its perspective on economics, especially. But because Rawls wrote a book that was aiming to support views people already had, that book became an incredible center for research and scholarship for about 50 years. So for 50 years, some of the very brightest philosophers, students, grad students, professors, worked on the project of rebuilding that book, of expanding the ideas, of making it stronger, building it into this incredible system, which now it's now become. There are something, if you took all the articles written about Rawls's book and put them on a bookcase, I've heard that the bookcase would be 20 feet by 10 feet solid, just articles about Rawls's book. Nozick, by contrast, wrote this daring, pyrotechnic, beautiful book, also flawed, also missing foundation that needed to be worked on, but he was immediately attacked. He was attacked for writing this contrarian, libertarian book. The attack was so unpleasant for him that he turned away from the project and went to work in other areas of political philosophy because he was getting not just no support, but attacks. And it could have been different. If Nozick's book had been written in a context where many people were interested in individual freedom, and he was surrounded by a culture and an academic culture where people cared about the problem of how do you justify individual freedom, the path of history might have been different. The path of intellectual might have been different. It would have been the case that there would be a 10 by 20 bookcase of articles all about Nozick, not just articles saying why he was wrong. And there was a lot of articles saying why he was wrong because he had so many critics. But there would have been people sympathetically reading Nozick, producing all kinds of articles making positive suggestions how to make that paradigm stronger. And it just was a really vivid. I learned this all happened. I graduated from college in 1987. So this all happened before I was thinking about these ideas. But I remember when I read those two books and I read the follow-up literatures, I was just so struck that one of the books attracted so much positive attention and constructive engagement, and then the other was basically attacked or not only read by a small number of us who found the ideas appealing. And that was a really striking example to me of how groupthink bends the course of intellectual history. It bends the course of our thinking of the possibilities politically. It bends students' perceptions of what's a reasonable approach to political thought, political society, ordering our world politically, and what's a crazy way of thinking about it. Nozick's view is no more crazy than Rawls's. They're both brilliant theories, but what was handed down to us was this idea that one book was eminently worth pursuing and philosophically rich and worth constructing and building on, whereas the other one was not. And on the merits, that's just not true. It's path dependency in action within the academy. And there are many other examples. Post-colonial studies is another one where, people find that an attractive paradigm, it appealed to some intuitions of existing academics. So it took off and became this big thing. I think it has some merit, but it's got lots of problems. I mean, huge problems. But there aren't other people building up the other theory as well as it might be. And this is true of classical liberalism generally. It's always been kind of an outsider's view, not because it's not vital, not because it hasn't helped our world become a better place. It has helped our world become a better place, I think, far more than rival doctrines. But the fact that the university has groupthink and is vulnerable to groupthink, the academics are vulnerable to our own biases. And when we think together, we tend to think in groupthink ways. And that's a constant danger we have to keep struggling against if you want to think freely.
Really powerful, Dr. Tomasi. In fact, I had always wondered why Nozick never decided to pursue his central ideas, which he talked about in that book later on in his career. And that seemed to answer that question. You'd find it
I've,
interesting that, you know,
I've spoken with him. I mean, he and I was at Harvard for a year, and
ah,
we used to hang out and talk about this stuff. And I asked him, and he told me, it just wasn't worth the beating. Not that he never turned away from those ideas. People claim that he did. He always kept the same ideas, but he just didn't want to take the abuse.
true,
I'm
it's
sorry,
kind of very
I
sad.
interrupted you. Yeah,
That is,
it
please.
is.
Yeah, I came across a textbook in introductory Western political theory, when I was in my first year of undergraduate studies. And, Rawls had like a dedicated 20 pages of chapter to him, while Nozick had like 4 pages. And it was just mentioned he's an apologist for a capitalist. That's about it. So it was very sad to, see
Yes.
that kind of legacy that got tarnished. But anyway, I think since we're already on the topic of political theory, we could turn to your book, which is Free Market Fairness, which was published by Princeton in 2012. Now, Tyler Cowen described your book as one of the best philosophical treatments of libertarian thought ever. Now, what struck me most about your book is the fact that your genuine commitment to bridging the ideas or the uncombinables of economic liberty, which is favorable to classical liberals, and social justice, which is favorable to left liberals, or whom you call high liberals, into a project that you call market democracy. So tell us a bit
That's right.
about this project and what motivated you to sort of write this book.
Thanks for that summary. That's a really precise description of a long and complicated book. So I appreciate that. Um, well, I'll say on the personal level first that the reason why I went into political philosophy was because I wanted to know what I thought myself about politics. So that was my purpose. I always wanted to know, like, what do I actually think about that? And when I wrote that book, I basically said I figured out what I thought, and I wrote it up in that book. So it's really that book in many ways was I've written some other books since then that I care a lot about. I recently finished a book on the history of individualism with Matt Zwolinski that I'm very happy. I have a new book coming out in a couple months on viewpoint diversity, what it is, why we need it, and how to get it. That's coming out in March. But free market fairness is always like near and dear to my heart because it's the book that really expresses what I believe. And when I wrote it, when I started writing it, what I was really aware of what I just described to the audience a moment ago about these two sides, about Rawls on one side and Nozick on the other side. And the way I saw political philosophy and the terrain of our thinking, that there was this real dichotomy between these two camps. On the one side, of sort of a free market, capitalist enthusiastic camp, individualist enthusiastic camp. On the other side, a more of a collectivist camp, a social justice camp. And the way I pictured it in my mind was like this frozen, the terrain of political philosophy when I was writing that book was like this frozen, windswept Arctic terrain. I'm looking outside my window now in Rhode Island, and there was a big snowstorm over the weekend, and I'm looking over a cove, which is actually frozen, and there's wind going across it. So the terrain of political philosophy was like that. Everything was locked in its place. And over on one side was the classical liberal side, was like these little tents, the embattled camps of the classical liberals with the wind blowing and flat, the few of them over there, doing their thing. And they defended, these are classical liberals or libertarians. They defended, limited government, strong private economic liberties, and they're very skeptical of social justice. On the other side of this frozen divide, was the camp of the Rawlsians, Marxists, other people on the collectivist side, a whole group of villages over there, kind of like igloos that were warmer than the tents that the classical liberals were hunkered down living within. igloos that had like heaters and furs and all the luxuries of academic life. And on that side, people in that camp, they were defending social justice, right? The idea that you create society and design it from the top, and you impose your design on society to make it better for everyone. They advocated an expansive government. They were very skeptical of economic liberty, highly skeptical of economic liberty. And there were political movements that are associated with the free market side and political movements on the big state side. But that's what I was looking at when I wrote the book, that there was this windswept divide between these two camps. And as a graduate student, I remember being told you had to choose. Either you have a career, a successful career by joining the winning camp, the class of the high liberals or the welfare liberals, or you have this embattled career by defending the classical liberals. But I believed in classical liberalism for a whole variety of reasons that I can describe. But then I also thought there's some interesting ideas on the other side. And I was facing this dichotomy that everyone in my generation was facing as we thinkers between economic liberty. Either you're for economic liberty and you're in one camp, or you're for social justice and you're in the other camp. Either you're for capitalism and you're in one camp, or you're for democracy and you're in the other camp. Either you're for Nozick or you're for Rawls, Nozick and Hayek and Adam Smith, or you're for Rawls and Rousseau and Marx. Um, yeah, either you're for free markets or you're for fairness. One side or the other, everybody has to choose. And I don't like that. I just dispositionally, I don't like the idea of being forced to choose between dichotomies like that. So I want to think, well, is there a way to bring them together? Is there a way to break up the ice and move pieces around in ways so that some insights that are being captured on one side, and they claim only they can defend these things, like caring for the least well-off members of our society, can those ideas be taken on board with people on the other side, the camp that I'm more dispositionally inclined toward, classical liberalism? Can we combine these things in some way? And so in free market fairness, I basically, these ideas, these debates between these conceptions of politics and society often really amount to debates about the nature of the person and the nature of what does it mean to be a human being and a human, a person. And on the Rawlsian, on the Nozickian libertarian side, you have theories of what a person is that come to us from Ayn Rand, from Nozick, that really are very individualistic, that a person is sort of as an atom by ourselves. We can be selfish, we can be just self-centered, we can be concerned mainly with ourselves. The other side thinks that people are caring about themselves, but they also care about society generally. They care about democracy, for example. And I decided, I think their conception, Rawlsian conception of what the person is, that we're kind of divided in our moral nature. It's important for us to think about ourselves as individuals, but we're also capable of thinking about the wider society. I became convinced that that way of thinking about the person was more morally attractive to me. So I decided to get on my dog sled and to go across the frozen terrain and go join the igloo crowd. But when I got there, I started breaking up the ice as soon as I could because I wanted to say to them, I noticed that they did not take economic liberty very seriously. And the most important insight of my book, the idea that launched that project and a bunch of other things that came out of that project, the Bleeding Heart Libertarian Movement, which we can talk about later if you like, got launched by that book. It really is based on this idea that economic liberty, the freedom to choose what occupation you pursue, but more than that, the freedom to choose the terms in which you do your work, the wages you receive or are willing to receive for the work you do. That strong economic liberty is a moral concept in itself, and that owning private property, is a fundamental right of human beings everywhere in all places. The Rawlsians don't think that. They think the question of whether property should be collectively owned or privately owned is not a morally foundational issue. Many of their accounts of society, their ideal institutional forms, rely upon the collective ownership of property, kind of a nod to the socialist Marxian conceptions. And my idea, probably from my own lived experience, was that economic freedom is a domain in which we define ourselves. And I mentioned at the start of this conversation, just from my personal experience, that I think I mentioned that my father died when I was very young. I was 8 years old, and my mother raised me and my three sisters on her salary as a middle school art teacher. But my father had been a pharmacist. He owned a small pharmacy in a small town. When he died, my mother sold the pharmacy, and she kept that money in the bank so that my sisters and I could have a chance to go to college later on when we grew up. I was 8 years old when my father died. So for those years, from me, when I grew up, I watched my mother work very hard as a middle school art teacher, careful with her money. Always we had spaghetti and red sauce. I'm not sure you guys know what that is, but it's a very cheap kind of meal that we'd have night after night because my mother was saving the money she had because she cared so much about education and wanted to give me and my three sisters a chance to go to college. It broke her heart that I was being such a terrible student, I should add. But anyway, she did that anyway. And what I observed though was that that was a moral choice she was making. My mother was defining herself. She was defining the kind of person that she was by the choices she was making in the economic realm. So that observation made me realize that the people on that left camp, and it goes back to John Stuart Mill, John Maynard Keynes is part of the school too. Rawls is the heir to that way of thinking. They don't take economic liberty very seriously. They think it's something you need. You have to have money, so you have to work. But they don't see that, in fact, working is a way of being in the world. When you choose your career, like I taught college students for many years, I would watch college freshmen and sophomores in my office having all these dreamy ideas of things they might do when they were freshmen and sophomores. But when they were juniors and seniors, they'd come to my office to talk about letters of recommendations for jobs they wanted. And they were making really tough decisions now for the first time in their lives about would they look for a career on Wall Street, or would they want to try to become an academic, or would they become a social worker, or a playwright, or a priest? What might they do? And they knew there were economic implications to all those choices. And they would struggle. I would watch their faces get tense, that kind of a tension on their face that they didn't have when they were younger because they were just carefree, you know, college freshmen. But by the time they were juniors and seniors, they were really thinking now about, what were the economic effects of these choices going to be on their lives? Who were they going to be? And what they were doing was crossing over the threshold of childhood or adolescence into adulthood. We crossed that threshold into adulthood, I think, largely by taking up economic responsibilities for our own lives. And I worry that societies, including some European social democracies, that provide a lot of do a lot of the economic decision making for their citizens, I worry that they, in some sense, infantilize their citizens. And there's an example from feminism that I'll just mention because it impacted me so directly when I was at Oxford in grad school. I had I taught some of my fellow grad student friends were women who were interested in feminism, and they turned me on to this literature, this 18th century literature, these 18th century feminists, some of the early English feminists, and the claim that feminists made, these women made over and over again, was that a woman could be given all the material means in the world. They could be like a bird in a bird cage, a golden bird cage with a feeder regularly filled up, with a water cup filled up for them, flying around like little birds in this cage. Ibsen has a play called The Cage. Um, but if they're not being treated as economic agents, as possible causes of that state of affairs, then you've treated them disrespectfully as women, no matter how much material stuff you give them. And I think something is true from that. I think there's a real insight there about economic liberty. The early feminists saw to give freedom for women, to struggle for freedom for women in England now in the 17 and 1800s especially, early 1900s too, to give women freedom and respect. The first step was to give them economic freedom, to protect their rights to own property so that women could actually own their own property, to protect their opportunities for education so that they could pursue careers and have jobs of their own. Economic liberty they saw because they didn't have it was morally important to them. And so that from those feminists, it emboldened me to think that these ideas of economic freedom, these ideas of property rights and the importance, it's not just for the rich people. It's not just for Ayn Rand and her superheroes who make a lot of money and are super powerful because of private liberties, but rather ordinary people, people like my mother, people like those feminists. They're making moral decisions when they make economic choices. So that was sort of a long answer to your question, but I just want to make that point to the audience and especially to the students that there's something about the realm of economic freedom. You can easily say, oh, it's capitalism, so boo, and socialism, yay. But I think there's a real moral defect within socialism as an ideal that's really picked up by those feminists and seen by those feminists. There's something in every ideal, there's defects, but the big defect in socialism, the big defect in that way of thinking is that it misunderstands how important it is to individual people to become authors of their own lives, to be causes of the particular life they're leading. And that's an enormously important moral issue. And once you see that, socialism looks different. It cares for the poor in ways that the capitalist societies often don't, but caring for the poor isn't enough. And if we could find a way to bring these two ideals together, recognizing and respecting people's individual economic liberties, including their property rights, while being committed to living in a society where everyone can look on each other's skills as a common bounty, as something that helps us all, then we have something special, something new. That's what I call market democracy, which I hold up as a rival to social democracy. That's anyway. So again, a long answer to your question. Forgive me.
That was nice. What I really liked about your work is how you based a defense of economic liberties on self-authorship, which you just talked about. And the fact that, after your scholarship, I believe at least a lot of work have come up that I'd say that is trying to look at a more genuine fusionism that cuts across partisan lines. I'm reminded of Mark Pennington's work on Foucault and liberal political economy, and
Yes.
that how that really cuts across that divide. Well, that's it.
Yes. Brilliant.
A
Brilliant.
final question. Mhm. Right, a final question before we open it up for the Q&A, which is in recent years
Sure.
at least, academic institutions in the United States have come under unprecedented political power. I believe all of us are aware of that. Given this turn of events, are you optimistic about the Heterodox Academy's efforts of fostering open inquiry?
That's a great question. It's the question I ask myself every morning when I wake up. First, I pinch myself to be sure I'm not still dreaming, and then, oh yeah, okay, I am in this world. I am still actually the president of Heterodox Academy, and there's work to do. But after I pinch myself, and I would do wake up, that's the question I wonder about. So at HXA, we work from the inside of our universities to try to make them better. And traditionally, we've been working from the bottom up, right? So we're professors and administrators, and we're trying to improve the universities. But we've often been doing our work against our university presidents, who tended to be more concerned with making the university a political partisan. A university should be a special place that's not should not be politically partisan itself. A university should truly be a place where we give people opportunities to think for themselves. That means providing students with respect. It means providing them with courses and with readings that allow them to see the great debates, the great discussions, the great disagreements at the foundations of politics and other areas too. But increasingly, universities have taken sides in the political wars, and they've taken the political sides, unfortunately, on one side, typically on the left and the post-colonial side in particular. And Heterodox Academy is trying to move universities forward to a place where we are inclusive, because universities were typically not very inclusive. We weren't inclusive of women at all until very recently, not inclusive in America of African American citizens until very recently. But we need to move through this period now of becoming more inclusive of people. People from lower class backgrounds often didn't have opportunities to go to elite schools. I was acutely aware that at Oxford, there's so many people I hung around with there from these wealthy backgrounds, some of them from India and Pakistan, Rhodes Scholars and the like. And these are my friends, and I wasn't from a background like that. But as universities become more inclusive, the question is, can we go on to like use those new ideas that are present on campus from people's lived experiences to think together better? And so that's an ideal out there. I have an essay called A University That the World Has Never Seen. And I describe in that short essay what I think we should be working toward. So it's a very tough fight. The big thing that I think I'll just mention, you've probably been watching from India, Donald Trump's administration when he came in January, a year ago now, he started attacking the universities, removing their funding, for threatening them with even deeper funding cuts, stopping foreign students from coming to the universities in America, which is, one of the great sources of America, of the strength of American universities, is that we've been so open and so enthusiastic about having students coming from all around the world to our great universities. The strength of Oxford and Cambridge has traditionally always been that too. Students from India and Pakistan and other places, of course, China, coming to our universities to learn and to add their ideas and their intelligence to our projects. We're losing a lot of that. So we're very concerned about the attacks on universities. But I just have to say, speaking frankly with you, that because of the attacks, we now at Heterodox Academy are finding university presidents are increasingly coming to us. They're coming to us not to argue with us about the purpose of the university, but to ask us, how do we improve our university? How do we make how do we create syllabi and course reading assignments that will truly allow students to think for themselves? So that's all. That's a sea change in the higher education in the Anglosphere. I think it's happening in Australia, to remarkable degrees as well. There's a real reckoning going on within universities because the public has lost faith in our universities. As universities became increasingly political, the public lost trust in what we're doing there. They lost faith in our sincerity to care for our students as free thinkers. And again, a free society requires free universities. But I think now we're recognizing that we're at a tipping point, perhaps, where we're either going to go down the path of conformity and groupthink, and I'm afraid to say a certain kind of political collectivism, or we may move to a different place where we're much more welcoming of diverse viewpoints, welcoming about recognizing that young people have ideas for the future that we old people need to learn from. And we urgently need to give opportunities for young people to read Adam Smith for themselves, not just read Marx over and over again. They should read Marx too. You should read Marx too. He's brilliant. But so is Adam Smith. So is Friedrich Hayek. So is Robert Nozick. There are many others that aren't read very often. They just have brilliant insights that have made our society, our Western societies, what they are.
Thank you, Dr. Tomasi. I think our conversation was very insightful. We could have a question and answer session right now. So please feel free to ask your questions via raising your hands. I think there's a button right down there, or you could put your questions in the chat box and we'll take them up.
Anshu, will you read the questions, or how do you want me to do this? I'll leave it to you to tell me what you want me to do.
I'll read the questions. That's fine. They could also raise their hands to ask questions if they want to.
Okay.
Yes, there's a question here. Many universities today are established on fairly partisan grounds. They often see themselves as engines of social change and concomitantly engage in political activism. How do you think universities should navigate the tension between open inquiry and activism?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a fantastic. Brett, that question is at the center of all the work that we do at Heterodox Academy. So I really appreciate that. I'll add a new term that I haven't mentioned yet. Humility. I think the core of a university, the core of a free thinking person, and in many ways the core of a free society is humility. Hayek talks about the fatal conceit, the conceit that its social planners can understand the world and fix it from the top using their engineering tools. And that's a conceit because, in fact, the world's more complicated than that, and human beings resist being ordered into places and to being required to play certain roles. We just are the kind of creatures that buck against that. So universities, I think, need to remember that we are a community of imperfect learners. We professors don't have all the answers. We know that. That's why we keep waking up and worrying about the things we worry about every night. We think when we work on these problems, we know we don't have enough knowledge. We come to the university and we have careers here because we want to learn more. So too with our students. A university is a special kind of community. We're not a community drawn together to have conformity and agreement on some thick set of moral ideals. If we do that, we lose what we should be, which is a place of excitement, of surprise, of ongoing adventure, of looking to the next generation for new ideas. Some people think that the role of young people at universities should be passive, that you students should come to the university to be lectured by your moral superiors or to be cemented into views you had when you arrived at the university. I think a university is a place where freedom should reign most of all, where out of respect for you, especially respect for the students, giving you the chance with all humility to tell you that all the ideas that we know at their very best, to teach you the things that we've learned, to pass on the great ideas from our civilizations, and then let you have the chance to think for yourself, the next generation, what you think about these ideas. That's what a great university should be. And so the question about activism prejudges a lot of those questions. Activists, their hearts are often in the right place, and I understand in many cases where they come from, but they're prejudging answers to questions that urgently need to be asked. We need to open questions up, not close them down at our universities.
Dr. Tomasi, there's another question. More often than not, young academics find themselves on the edge. Early career scholars worry about expressing heterodox views, since doing so may carry professional risk, especially in an era of increasing anarchism and declining tenure security. What advice would you offer to young academics who are committed to intellectual honesty and are navigating polarized academic environments?
That's a great question. Again, a really great question and one that we struggle with. I've lived through it myself when I was lucky enough to escape my wayward ways and arrive at Oxford. I was just amazed at how uniform so I was working with the greatest philosophers in the world, people I'd heard about, who I revered because they were geniuses, but they were all on the political left. And I was really struck by one professor who took me under his wing. His name is G.A. Cohen. Jerry Cohen is a Marxist. And he was the only professor who was interested in talking with me about individual freedom because he loved ideas. And so I faced that as an academic. I was told, stay with the big camp and you'll win, or go with the small camp and you'll lose. But what I found in my career is that there is still underneath the ideology, there's a respect for creativity, there's a respect for excellence. If you present your ideas in ways that try to work with the premises that the other people share, if you can work from their premises and then move the conversation, then you can actually advance the conversation. The biggest danger for people who think in heterodox ways within the university, especially young professors trying to make their way, is that they think that they can just write a book or write articles or have views that they're just their own ideas, not connected to the ongoing research project of the academy. The power and the way to become a successful academic is to find ways to have your own ideas and keep them, hold your freedom, but then connect that freedom to ongoing research projects out of respect for those projects and try to make those projects better. So if you're a lone ranger, it's hard to make a career in the academy. But if you're someone who's willing to do the hard work to read the literature as it exists, whether it's post-colonial or whatever it might be, understand the deep roots of it, and then move on those roots and turn it back to what you truly believe as a matter of integrity to your own beliefs, there's special power there. And I'll just say one more thing there. There's a lot of ideas in the classical liberal tradition that are because they've been so neglected, they're really fresh and they're really interesting. If you can find opportunities to present those ideas in ways that are palatable to people who don't agree with them and help them see the insight and the beauty in those ideas, you can have some pretty remarkable successes.
Thank you for that, Dr. Tomasi. There are three more questions. I'll first take Narendra and then Divyanshu's question. So Narendra asks, there are over 500 private universities in India, mostly turned to be as private business enterprises of some persons or corporates, where only rich can only get admissions. Can such universities facilitate free thinking? Now, that's an interesting question.
It is. I don't know enough about those particular universities. I will say that um, I find it encouraging that there's a large variety of kinds of universities within India. One of the great strengths of the American university system, especially as it rose to prominence in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, was that in the U.S. People were constantly creating new kinds of colleges with new kinds of purposes. So there's a great flowering, an efflorescence of an explosion of universities being founded in the U.S. At first, many of those colleges were highly exclusive. And when they were exclusive, of course, that limited the range of talent that they could bring within them. I don't know the details. I see there are some details behind that question that I'm aware. I don't know those details, so I don't know what the structures are or what the iniquities might be. But I think it's positive to hear that there are universities with great variety. And I hope they will evolve to a place where they come to see that bringing in talented people, bring talent belongs at universities. And universities that find talent and find ways to create scholarships for such people, they may find they have a competitive advantage against other universities in that same set that don't search for talent, they just look for people with money. Over time, I think that will be the case. That might not help you right now, but I think over time that's been the path I've seen in many countries.
Right. Divya asks, if a society supports open inquiry and free debate, can it handle deep disagreements on values without breaking the shared moral foundations needed for democracy to function?
My gosh, who are you people? These are great questions. I love what a great that's a classic question in political philosophy. We call it the problem of tolerating the intolerant. So what do you do if you're an open society and you allow people to think for themselves and to collect into groupings and to create associations and all kinds of membership groups where they can let people in and keep people out? What do you do when some of these groups become very intolerant of other people and they reject the very ideas of the society itself? This is a classic problem in political philosophy. The question is something like, how wide is the circle of we? How wide is a circle in which we say we are all working together? We are part of a common project. We disagree about how to move society forward, but we are going to commit to working together and talking to each other, trying to convince each other to move the world. These are classical liberal ideas. These are Enlightenment ideas, I suppose. And there are groups and there are ideologies that reject those ideas, that are exclusionary. They say, without any humility, that they have the truth in settled form now. That way of thinking is anathema to a free university and to a free society. So there are boundaries to how wide the circle of we is. There has to be a capacious space for people to disagree and to be free. There has to be that if we're going to have a society worth living in. But there have to be some boundaries too, where certain ideas are so pernicious, are so unrespectful of others, that are so that are so conceited in their understanding that they think they have the whole truth. They see anyone who thinks differently as an enemy, and those must be stood up to and fought against.
Right. Teja has a question which is not directly pertinent to a session, but I'll still take it up, which is the Protestant ethic of hard work drives industrial success, while biblical principles of environmental guardianship forms the moral foundation of green political movement. How do these economic and ethical forces coexist and balance within US's society and politics?
Can you say that a bit? So is the question, does hard work determine success? Is that what
Yeah,
you're asking?
yeah. The Protestant ethic of hard work drives industrial success, while he claims that biblical principles of environmental guardianship forms the moral foundations of green political movement. How do these
Yeah,
economic and ethical forces sort of balance out within the US society?
that's great. I love that. Yeah, there are serious questions and have been historically about how a market society can function within the economic that's our how an economic system like a free market society can function within an environmental set of parameters. So these are questions that have been historically been part of liberalism. Adam Smith and Robert Malthus argued about this in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, where Malthus thinking the environment could only hold so many people and that economic growth could never get us out of that. We get more population, the population trap argument, many of you probably know. So these questions about whether economic liberties exercised freely by people, releasing their creative energies into the world, building new things, industrialization, that are these things compatible with our environment that we live within and a healthy environment they live within? I think a broad look at environmental history, which is a strong interest of mine, shows that in fact many societies, as they become more wealthy, go through phases, and later on, as they become more wealthy, markets make them more wealthy, they start being able to move in more green directions. And there are many surprises in this area. I'll just mention one. About a month ago, I was invited to moderate a debate at MIT about Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a big technological, one of the best tech schools in the world, on 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 um, on environmentalism. And I expected a debate between two teams, one saying pro markets, one saying pro environment. But what they all want to talk about was, what they all want to talk about were these new technologies of carbon capture. So rather than debating should developing countries like India be required not to use coal to help the environment and therefore slow down their economic growth, these MIT specialists in environmental science, some of the best environmental scientists in the world, they think the current action is actually ahead of that. It's really a question not how do we make a better environment by stopping the output of carbon, rather how do we make a better environment by developing the new technologies of carbon capture, finding ways letting the carbon go to be used for producing goods, but then capturing that carbon so it doesn't have environmental damages. That's a sign, just an early sign of what we've seen so often in history, where markets surprise us. The creative capacities of human beings are unleashed within markets in ways they're not unleashed within any other economic or social system. That doesn't always make good things, it often makes very difficult things. I'm aware of that. But it produces magic and the possibility that environmental sustainability can be out there in a future that's driven by economic growth. So economic growth and green ideals are not at war with each other. Green ideals might best be realized through market discoveries that are yet to come, and may, according to my friends at MIT, be coming sooner than we think.
Thank you. There's a question by Tejas. It's a very brief question. How do we practically distinguish between protecting free inquiry in universities and allowing genuinely harmful information?
Yeah, so there's a lot of debates in the U.S. about misinformation and wrong ideas, and it's a really long and complicated, or a deeply complicated question. You know, you probably won't be surprised to hear that I lean towards the idea that letting information out there for people to sort through is we should err in that direction rather than in the direction of closing down information and preventing it from going out there. I know there's problems with the new technologies, and AI is disrupting so many of our current paradigms of understanding what's true and what's not true. And these are serious issues. If you have a free society that's flooded at a key moment with a strategically designed set of misinformation, you can disable that whole society. That's a tactic that people are war planning for now. But I think that the question about finding new norms, new ways of new creative ways of sorting good information from bad information, that's a problem that I'd rather see entrepreneurs doing and offering to people freely than having the government do through censorship. There's a role for government, I think, in this area for sure, but there's also great dangers of government deciding for us in advance what counts as information and misinformation. Political parties in power tend to want to stay in power, and if they're given the power to control the flow, if they are given the power to control the flow of information, unfortunately, we'll likely find that they control it in ways that keep themselves in power rather than unleashing the free exchange of ideas. So such a complicated issue that you raised, and I know it's not a very adequate answer on my part, but that's how I tend to process that question. That's the system I would sort of work through to think it through to a deeper level.
Thank you. There seems to be another question. What suggestions do you have on how to break the ice in the frozen lake? So, between the embattled camps of the classical liberals and the igloos of the high liberals, so that the two sides of camps talk to each other more and have a more common ground. Because today I feel they're increasingly getting inward looking and more set in their own thinking.
Yeah, polarization is a huge problem across our world. We see it in Australia, we see it in India, we see it in Canada, we see it in some surprising places, Denmark, for example, Sweden, Chile, the US, of course. And I think polarization is connected to the problem about disinformation and misinformation. People often receive their news from the bubble that reinforces the things they already believe, rather than getting their information from sources that might challenge the things they already believe. Something I haven't mentioned that I probably should is just that the field of social psychology has and evolutionary biology in particular have given us some insights in the past 30 or 40 years that are really fundamental. I talk about free thinking, I talk about open inquiry as these wonderful things, but what I haven't said to you is that In fact, for every one of us as a human being, free thinking is an unnatural practice. It's easy to say, and I've been saying it easily too. Free thinking, you should think for yourself. You should be given diverse readings that you'll think freely and you'll become this free thinking person. The fact is, and a lot of science backs this up, we are all biased creatures. We tend to studies show that when we read a news story that confirms something we currently think, we remember that story much more vividly than the story we read just after it that didn't cohere with the way we think about the world. So our brains evolved in ways, our Stone Age minds evolved in ways that make us tend towards bias. They make us tend towards groupthink. They make us tend away from true open-mindedness. To become open-minded is really a struggle. Fortunately, those literatures in evolutionary biology and social psychology are becoming more mainstream. And in the United States higher education system, for example, there are now a lot of tools that are being used by AI, and Heterodox Academy is pioneering one of these sets of tools to try to break down that natural fact about ourselves. I'll just say something for a moment, if I may. There's an AI tool that you can find online and look up if you want to play with it yourselves. It's sponsored by Heterodox Academy. It's called Sway. I'll spell it Sway. And Sway is an online a tool. With Sway, you're paired with a person who answer some questions about politics, and you get paired with a person who answers those same set of questions differently than you do. Then you're put into a conversation with that person, but there's a moderator, an AI moderator, who looks at the questions you're going to ask to that person and adjusts them to make you see your own biases. And the AI guide looks at the answers that your interlocutor is going to make to you, and it helps that person reformulate the question so they see their own biases too. So the fact of human bias is a fact of human nature. It makes free thinking an unnatural practice. But that makes it all the more important that we struggle and find what our biases are, learn ways, use like tools like Sway to get better about our biases, to become more aware of them, to do the hard work that needs to be done to be a free thinker and to remain one. So again, it's a fabulous issue, but it's an issue in which I think humans are making a lot of progress, despite our biases, despite all our tendency towards one-sidedness.
You, Dr. Tomasi, for that again. Since I see no more questions there, I'll just take the chance to ask you one final question before we end this session.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you just mentioned about bleeding heart libertarianism while you were talking about the debate between Rawls and Nozick, and
Yeah.
when we were in the segment of political theory. So, what exactly
Yeah.
is bleeding heart libertarianism? I think our Indian audience might be interested in knowing about it, since bleeding heart is something that's usually associated with people on the left side of the aisle and not so much on the right side.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
how did you guys come about that term?
Yeah, so I didn't start the term. I started being called a bleeding heart libertarian by people. Some of my critics, especially on the left, called me that. But then other people, it became a badge of pride eventually. And a friend of mine, a professor at the University of San Diego, Matt Swilinski, with whom I recently wrote a book on it called "The Individualists: A History of Libertarianism." He started a blog called Bleeding Heart Libertarians, and it came out the blog started shortly after my book came out, Free Market Fairness. It became a gathering point for people, philosophers from around the world, and economists and some historians to talk about the possibility that caring about free markets and caring about libertarian ideas is compatible with caring about the poor. And for me, the way I always thought about was in some ways that was the most obvious thing in the world. Adam Smith was criticized in his day, in fact, by Robert Malthus. Adam Smith was the father of the free society in many ways, that was criticized for talking too much about the poor by Robert Malthus. He said, "Why are you always banging on about the how factories are going to make people dumb as animals, and they need to have education, publicly funded education for this and that and that?" If you look into the classical liberal history, you'll find that the early liberals, people like Locke, but especially Adam Smith, were very concerned about the fate of all the people in society. They imagined a truly inclusive society, a market society being a truly inclusive society where the talents and skills of people, women, men, younger people, are brought into the market to be unleashed for freedom and for the benefit of us all. So bleeding heart libertarianism is this combining the uncombinables. It's that little camp I described, the windswept camp that I kind of grew up in, as it were, combined with some of the highest ideas of socialism, the highest ideas of being honest about our histories, being honest about colonial legacies within societies, which is obviously is incredibly important within India, to be serious about the ways early capitalism was designed in ways and was manipulated by certain powerful people, often in government, against certain classes of people, whole classes of people, but that's not what capitalism is. That doesn't define what a free market society is, even though that's part of the history, unfortunately, part of the legacy, especially in India, but not only in India, it was true in America too. So moving forward to a bleeding heart libertarian view is a way of thinking, well, libertarians care about individuals, bleeding hearts care about other people. So a bleeding heart libertarian is a person who recognizes that we have these two sides to our moral nature that I described before. It's appropriate and reasonable and beautiful for each of us to take our own lives seriously. That's the great insight in Ayn Rand, in my view. Ayn Rand saw that many of us don't take our own lives sufficiently seriously. And if we did take our lives more seriously, we would unleash the creative powers that are authentically our own. That's a great insight. But added to that, the idea that we also can see that we live in a world with other people, that our fates are bound up with their fates too, that we have reasons to care about people who are beyond ourselves, that selfishness is not the whole of morality, that there's space within the idea of individualism for a certain a sense of community, a certain sense of solidarity, a certain commitment, as I see it, that to want to live in a society where everyone's free, but no one's enslaved, that everyone is actually a true participant in this society. And that's one way to describe what bleeding heart libertarianism is.
Right. I think we don't have any more questions, so we could end it here. But I just had another. I mean, I was curious to know: is it the same thing as neoclassical liberal ideas? Oh, there's someone that is asking the same thing as well. Oh my,
Uh, so
that's
neoclassical
interesting.
liberalism. So Jason Brennan, who's a political philosopher and a good friend of mine, he was a fellow at the center I directed at Brown for years. Jason and I invented that term, that very ugly term, neoclassical liberalism, at around the time that people were starting to call us bleeding heart libertarians. And neoclassical liberals was the idea that we wanted to revive some classical liberal ideas from Hayek, from Mises, from Adam Smith, perhaps most of all, the idea that caring about this is free society means caring about everyone who's part of the free society. So neoclassical liberalism was kind of a technical phrase that Jason and I came up with. Again, kind of an ugly phrase, and it didn't catch on. So bleeding heart libertarianism, but it's that idea that we can remake the classical liberal tradition as something new. Any ideology worth taking seriously should be a growing, living doctrine. There are some ideologies that get stuck in a certain way of seeing. They think they have the whole truth. And they just crank out like a machine answers to every social question the same. You can predict what they're going to say before they even say it because you know the machine crank that they're cranking. But a truly valuable doctrine, a truly powerful ideology is an ideology which is capable of reinventing itself. It's capable of ongoing debates within it. It's capable of allowing for dissenters and encouraging dissenters to make itself better. And so neoclassical liberalism was our Jason and my ugly way to try to describe our view. Someone else came up with bleeding heart libertarianism, and they sell T-shirts now. They sell T-shirts and coffee mugs with bleeding heart libertarian. Imagine a T-shirt that said neoclassical liberalism on it. Wouldn't sell very well. But a bleeding heart libertarian, that's a much catchier phrase. So in the world of commercial marketing, that we live in a free society and a free academy, that idea and that label dominated and our sort of fell away. Fair enough. I like change, even when it goes against me.
Thank you for that. I think some of your ideas, especially neoclassical liberal ideas, in some sense, uh, do speak to Indian realities, especially because social justice is a huge part of the Indian cultural ethos ever since we got independence, and social justice has become embedded with the role of the state in India. So there could
Yeah.
be interesting projects or research was undertaken in such areas to figure those things out. But yes, thank you everyone for joining in, and thank you, Dr. Tomasi, again for taking out time for this conversation. Let us keep trying to go beyond, I believe, tribal, parochial, tribalism of sorts and towards an open society, as Popper would say. I believe open inquiry is the way ahead and will help us in that pursuit. So thank you all once again.
Thank you, Anshu. Thank you, everyone.